22. Alex Smith is joining us from America Rising. Big day for tax reform in America. Alex, good afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so the House has passed the Republican tax reform bill and now goes to the Senate. And I'm assuming, because we called a vote today, that the Senate has just barely enough votes for this thing to pass.
Yes, they do have enough votes for pass, assuming no last-minute shenanigans.
Right, which, it's 2017. It's entirely possible.
In Congress.
No, never would we see any shenanigans in Congress. So what are some of the highlights as you see it? I mean, the big thing that I see that could be potentially game-changing for the U.S. is a reduction in the corporate tax rate to 21%. And there are some other things that aren't really perfect in my opinion, but I do think it's an overhaul that's been much needed.
Sure. I mean, this is just a huge day for the American people. This is sweeping tax reform that is going to affect every person in the country. And I think that when, there's something in this bill for everyone, whether you look at the corporate rates like you just mentioned that are going to make our economy, make our country more competitive again in the world, or if you look at the expanded child care credits, if you look at the increased standard deduction for individuals and for married couples, everyone is going to see something in this bill or from this bill next year. I thought after the bill was passed, Congressman Brady said he gave a great catchphrase. He said, come next year, check your check, see what see the change actually in your wallet. And I think that that's going to be hugely impactful for so many middle-class families across the country.
It's an interesting strategy to take right now, because if they're touting President Trump as the payroll or paycheck president, and they're talking about being able to look at your payroll check a year from now and seeing an increase of $2,000 for the average family with a median income, and that doesn't happen, that's extremely damaging to this president's reputation and another nail in the coffin of this Congress's reputation.
Well, and look, I think that this is something the president were very mindful of. I think that they knew that they needed to get something done by the end of the year. I think that that's why they worked so hard on tax reform. This is really to the credit of Republican House leaders, but also the president himself, who went to Capitol Hill several times to lobby senators specifically on the passage of this bill, and I think has been very involved with helping everyone get across the finish line. So they've known what's been at stake, because in 2016 the American people sent a clear signal with their votes, including the great state of Ohio. They said, we're tired of gridlock in Washington. I don't even think it was so much about political parties as much as it was about, we're tired of the way things are going. We're tired of the way that, we send all these guys to Washington, nothing seems to get done. Meanwhile, my paychecks are getting smaller. The economy's not growing at a rate that I think it should be. And so, 2016 was about the American people using their voice and using their vote to affect that change. 2017 was about, what are these guys going to do with it now that we have control over the different branches of government? And so I think that President Trump and the congressional Republicans, they were very mindful of that and acted accordingly.
We now have 7 tax brackets, which I think is about 3 or 4 too many tax brackets. The alternative minimum tax is back in there. Estate taxes are back in there. And there are other deductions that were put back in to reach a compromise with some of the Republican senators who are leaning against voting for the tax bill this week. But all in all, I think it's a step in the right direction. It's just not the massive tax overhaul that I had personally been hoping for. I mean, I want to see taxes go down for everybody across the board, but I also want the tax code simplified, and this just seems to be adding more pages to the tax code rather than taking away from it.
I mean, look, I'm in agreement with you. I would have liked it if we could have, really blown up the whole system
Right.
to a certain extent. Had sweeping reform in terms of the kinds of, I think that we should have, we should be aiming generally for a tax system that's fair and that's simple. I think that the Republican bill, though, really gets us a lot closer to that, though. And, I think, again, this is something that was difficult, to get through when you have such differing opinions in Congress. And first of all, it's worth pointing out that you had no help from the Democrats. I mean, no one came across the aisle. No one was willing to work with Republicans on this.
Well, and I could also make an argument that Republicans didn't really try either.
Well, look, I think that the Republicans did, and when people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are out there, before we even have language for this bill to read, saying that this is a political gift to Democrats and that if they defeat it, they're going to take back the House. I mean, it's really difficult to start negotiating with people from that posture when they're aiming to tank what you're doing on the basis of it being good for their political fortune. So I think that look, Republicans are up against a lot. You're up against
that's
a
what
lot
both parties do.
And,
Republicans did that for the last 4 years too.
Well, I think that that's something that when the Republicans in 2016. I think that that's something that they had recognized in terms of wanting to campaign for something rather than against something. And I think that the Democrats are going to learn the hard way that you really just can't be against something. You can't just have a knee-jerk response and say no. Republicans did operate that way for a long time, and in some years it worked for us, in other years it didn't. And I think that the Democrats who didn't even attempt to come across the aisle on this, I'm thinking about vulnerable senators like Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia or Senator Donnelly in Indiana. They're going to have to answer to their constituents at the end of the day who want this Congress to work with the president to get things done for the American people.
One of the more interesting things is that the popularity, at least in some polls, for the tax reform bill has been declining. So Republicans are in essence losing the public relations battle, which is also key to being able to call this a success for the party.
Well, look, I think that it's a little early to tell still. I think that the details of the plan are extraordinarily complicated. It's very difficult to go out there and to message about a bill that affects everyone differently. I would say that for the most part affects middle-class families positively in this country, but every taxpayer is different. So you can't just come up with like some sweeping generalization in a lot of cases for some of these messaging points. The Democrats, though, were completely incoherent in their message. I mean, they got so many Pinocchios from the Washington Post about the things that they were saying about this bill that I can't really count them all anymore. And so they, in terms of claiming that this is somehow detrimental to middle class families, I think that that's just false on its face when you look at how the standard deduction will increase, when you look at things like the child care tax credits. And so, I would say public opinion polls in the December, right before the holidays when this thing is passing, are going to be a lot different than when people look at their paychecks next year. And
it'll be very important in 14 months, especially before the midterms. Alex Smith is the executive director of America Rising. You can find out more at americarisingpac.org and follow her on Twitter at Alexandra C. Smith. Alex, have a great Christmas. We'll talk very soon.
Thank you. You too.